So we have this notion of DRM as a means of making the internet worse at copying. It has been a historic failure. So we have some new and exciting notions for making the internet worse at copying that don't involve DRM. For example, we have this notion of filtering, that somehow you can create a list of all the copyrighted works, and then you can ask the ISPs to find copyrighted works moving over their networks, and when they detect them, to remove them, to stop them from being delivered. This, if this actually worked, if it were actually possible to identify things like copyrighted work using software, it would likewise be possible to identify things like spam using software. In other words, if you had a working copyright filter, you'd also have a working spam filter, and you'd be a billionaire, and you wouldn't have to worry about making the internet worse at copying. We have this notion now of takedown, the idea that you can just send a letter out to an ISP and make them remove material by accusing them of hosting infringing stuff without having to talk to a judge or show any evidence that there's any wrongdoing. Not only has this opened the door to infinite abuses, the Church of Scientology and American voting machine company Diebold have abused the DMCA and these takedown mechanisms to make their critics disappear from the internet, but it's been wholly ineffective at making stuff that people really want to go away, go away. You know, you can ask Paris Hilton how easy and how well the takedown mechanism works. The internet will never forget Paris Hilton's fearsome genitals, no matter how hard we try. Some things once seen can never be unseen, and the internet will just keep on making copies of that forever and ever and ever. You just don't ever get the food coloring out of the swimming pool. There's actually only one area of policy and law where we pretend that information actually can be removed or contained once it's been generated, and that's the collection of personally identifying information, where we act as though we can put up thousands and thousands of CCTVs all around the country. We can gather an infinite amount of data on everyone who shows up. You can insist on people giving you ID when they check into hotels. You can take their fingerprints when they fly out of Heathrow Terminal 5, and so on. And somehow this information won't leak out and be distributed. It's a special kind of information that is hard to copy. It turns out this isn't true. It turns out that things like HMRC losing 25 million families' financial data isn't the exception, but the rule. We keep finding out about these data Valdezes every day, but that's a talk for another day. So we've been so preoccupied by the idea that it's possible to make a copy-proof internet that we haven't noticed that copying is only the internet's warm-up act, that it just turns out that copying is just the thing it does for starters. Now that's pretty exciting, because copying has put us in range of one of the oldest and most noble dreams of humanity, universal access to all human knowledge. This is not a bug of the internet, but a feature, and we seem to be getting there and closer every day with projects like the Internet Bookmobile and distributed proofreaders and so on. It seems like we're getting closer and closer to that all the time, but that's just for starters. The internet is even better at nuking collaboration costs, undermining the cost of getting people to do stuff together. And this is the realization of an even more important human dream than universal access to all human knowledge. It's the age-old dream of being superhuman. Literally superhuman. That is to say, doing more than one human can do. That superhumanness was identified by Ronald Coase in 1937 in a paper that he eventually won the Nobel Prize for as the core task of all firms, institutions, and organizations, to get people together, pointed in the same direction, moving in the same direction, and getting stuff done together. It's whether you're a bank, a terrorist organization, a movie company, or a group of people trying to decide on where to go to dinner, the cost of collaborating is the single biggest limiter on all of your activities. And what the internet has done is made this cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Now, the cheaper collaboration is, the more money there's left over for profit, the more time there is left over for profitable enterprise. So we live in the era of the Ronald Coase internet, the internet where collaboration is so cheap it's practically free. We build encyclopedias now the way that ants build hills. We erect operating systems in a way that was completely inconceivable 20 years ago. Imagine if, when Microsoft set out to build its first operating systems, if it had done so in the way that Linux had, it would be a little like saying, well, we're going to erect a skyscraper on this empty lot here. So if anyone has any structural steel lying around, or some blueprints, or some fixtures, or some bolts, or arc welder or a hard hat. Just turn up with whatever you've gotten and start going at it. And in 20 years, we'll have the most beautiful industrial strength skyscraper in the world. It will be the model for all skyscrapers to come. That is, in fact, what we've done with GNU Linux. Firefox, which set a world record yesterday for most downloads ever, the world's best browser, was developed in just this way. But that kind of explicit collaboration is just the start. We actually have far more implicit modes of collaboration that are even more exciting. For example, many of you know the service Flickr. It's an image sharing service that was founded by Stuart Butterfield and Katerina Fake and sold to Yahoo, is now run by Yahoo. One of the things that Flickr has is the notion of tagging, where you can assign arbitrary keywords to your images, and then people who want to watch that keyword can subscribe to it, see all the new images that have been tagged that way in a day. And of course, there are some tags that are very concrete. You might have b.TWEEN08 as a tag, and chances are that everything there is going to more or less be about b.TWEEN08, and it's pretty easy to see how everyone could arrive at b.TWEEN08 as their tags for images from b.TWEEN08. But where you get into the abstract terms, it becomes incredibly interesting. So there's a tag that I've been following now for about 4 years called decay, D-E-C-A-Y, decay, a very abstract notion. And on any given day, decay probably has between 100 and 200 photos, and they range from things like that horrible thing in the back of your office fridge to a beautiful macro-focused picture of a leaf crumbling in the autumn, to photos of old barns collapsing gracefully in on themselves, to beautiful brickwork with faded, painted-on signs advertising sodas for 3p from the 1920s and so on. This has become a kind of cross between a meditation and a photo essay on the subject of decay, and it's an entire book's worth every day. And it's done by people who've never met, never communicated with each other, never held a meeting to determine what does and doesn't go into the decay tag, have arrived at a rough consensus almost by accident, almost through some kind of group mind that had no explicit communication, no explicit constitution. It just kind of happened, right? Photo essay books tended to require a little more institutional underpinning than that before now. But even that looks like heavyweight collaboration costs next to the collaboration that gave birth to Google. So you and me and anyone who've ever made a link between two web pages have created the underlying structure of the internet that Google looks to every day to find out what the internet is about. Google counts all the links on the internet and determines, based on which sites have the most links going to them from the most linked to pages, which ones are most important, which ones are of less importance. You and I and everyone who've ever made a link, we're actually collaborating together to create this underpinning, this semantic underpinning for the internet that Google is mining, this implicit underpinning for the internet that Google is mining, without ever actually talking to each other, without ever communicating with each other and planning to do it. This low cost of collaboration has given us 1 billion YouTube videos, blog posts, Flickr photos, and so on, and thankfully most of them are shit. That's actually tremendous news, because it means that the cost of failure has gotten so low that you can try practically anything. I don't know if you've noticed that one of the externalities of the housing bubble in the UK and elsewhere is that practically every high street in every expensive city looks pretty much the same. You have the 3 betting shops, the 2 high street banks, 1 of 5 grocery stores, and so on. What you don't have is like the independent designer who's just opened a shop doing something probably doomed but nevertheless interesting to visit for the 3 Saturdays they're open before they fall apart. You don't have the restaurant that's serving food that you've never heard of. You don't have any of that kind of experimental stuff, because once you raise the cost of experimenting to a value that's so high that you need £1 million before you can even get started, experimentation falls by the wayside, and progress is what emerges from experimentation. It's fantastic that it no longer costs a fortune to find out if your idea sucks, that you can find out if your idea sucks almost for nothing in about 10 seconds and walk away from it. You know, I've heard people say, well, if you look at the number of blogger blogs that have been started in the last 5 years, you'll see that 85% of them or 95% of them were abandoned after 3 posts. People just walked away. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't it wonderful that, that instead of having to sit down and hire a web person and do a lot of work and a lot of planning and spending a lot of money to find out whether or not you want to create a blog, you just create one, try it for 3 posts, change your mind, and move on. That's a really wonderful place to be.